As Joel Brown said, and I'll quote, he said, "I saw the blinding flash of red flame run along the crest of those works and heard the deafening crash as the awful work began. Then the air seemed filled with all the sounds it was possible for it to contain. The hiss of the deadly Minnie, the scream of the shell, the crackle, crash, and roar of every conceivable missile. And through it all, that red blaze along the crest of that work which we must cross, as we, with bowed heads, breasted that storm."
Okay, we're going to talk about Mr. Tom Huntington. He's a historian, he's an author, he's an editor, and he's also a speaker. And he's a son of a Union veteran. So there's a plug for the people who are members in that order. Um, he has a book, Searching for George Gordon Meade, Civil War Trails of Pennsylvania, the Monument Guidebook, as you see behind him. That's a common book. I have that book. We've all seen that book sitting on a rack somewhere, and I'm sure you might even have it yourself. There's more books, as if you were to check them out online, you will see that. Where have you not seen them? Because I've seen them do a talk with the Gettysburg Foundation, addressing Gettysburg. I believe it was twice, which I love because they are like conversations, and that's also good too instead of a talk. And various roundtables. I just saw recently, it was like the Cincinnati Roundtable or something like that. Um, or maybe you just know his work with the American History, the Historic Traveler, the Smithsonian, American Heritage, Civil War Times, and these are just a few of the types of publications you would see him at. He's here today. He's going to do a talk about his 2018 book, um, uh, coming into Maine. I'm going to let him do that introduction.
Great. I really appreciate the invitation. I did speak at the museum, at the old museum location back, and it was probably 2018 when this book came out, Maine Roads to Gettysburg, which was published in 2018. So I'm going to not, I'm going to try not to run over that same ground today. I am working on what I call the sequel to Maine Roads to Gettysburg, and it's going to be called the Maine Roads to Appomattox. And where the first book followed Maine soldiers from the beginning of the war through, of course, Gettysburg. This one will pick up the story, in the fall of 1863, and then follow these soldiers to the end of the war. Some of them, did appear in the first book, and then some of them did not. Um, I'll tell a little bit about myself, just a little bit. I was born and raised in the great state of Maine. I grew up in Augusta, which is the state capital. I attended Bowdoin College for 2 years, and in fact, one of my fraternity brothers is Joshua Chamberlain. We did not go to school at the same time, I hasten to add, but we did both join the same fraternity. In fact, the fraternity building is right across Potter Street from the Joshua Chamberlain House and Museum in Brunswick, Maine. And when I was a student in Brunswick, it was not a museum. That house was just student housing. It was apartments, and it had fire escapes all over it. And as far as I know, there wasn't even a plaque saying that this was Chamberlain's house. But now it's a beautiful museum. If you've never been to Brunswick, I encourage you to visit and see that, because they have a lot of his. They have his Medal of Honor. They have a lot of his artifacts, his boots, his saddle. So it's quite a fascinating place to visit. I now live in Pennsylvania. I'm in mailing address is Camp Hill. I'm really in Fairview Township, and I'm about 40 miles away from Gettysburg. So I do like to get down and visit the battlefield as much as possible. So I've been, mulling over this sequel book for a long time, and I finally retired at the beginning of this year. So I had the time I could devote to it, because it does take a lot of time, and with this book and the previous book, it takes a lot of travel, a lot of visits to Maine, especially. I just got back on Monday from a research trip I went on. I went to Bowdoin College because they have some tremendous stuff in their archives. I went to Providence, Rhode Island, where I read the letters of Selden Connor, he was in the 7th Maine, and then in 1864 he became the colonel of the 19th Maine. And he wasn't long in command because he was badly wounded on the second day's fighting in the wilderness. And fascinating story. He was a lawyer. He was trained to be a lawyer. He was a good writer. And perhaps best of all for historians, he had good handwriting. So I can actually read what he wrote. And I'll talk a little bit about his stuff. I find him a fascinating figure. I did not know this until not too long ago that he's buried in Augusta. He's buried in a cemetery I know well in Augusta, Maine. I used to play frisbee in a field above this cemetery, which is called at a place called Blaine Park, where James G. Blaine is buried. And Selden Connor's just down the hill from James G. Blaine. So I did visit his grave a few years ago. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I don't want to talk about Connor quite yet. I'll start off by talking about someone with whom I have a personal connection. These are the enlistment papers of my great grandfather, Daniel True Huntington. He was served in the 31st Maine, and that wasn't raised until the spring of 1864. So obviously, he was not around for the Battle of Gettysburg. He was one of 14 children. 14 children. He was from Litchfield, Maine. His papers say he was 5 feet 5 inches tall. He said he was 18 years of age, which was in fact not true. His recruiting officer who signed the paper said that Huntington was, quote, entirely sober when he enlisted and also of lawful age. He was not. He was technically too young to enlist, but he enlisted anyway. He was injured outside Petersburg, as best I can piece together from his pension records. On April 2nd, the day of the Union breakthrough of the Confederate lines outside Petersburg, obviously the beginning of the end for Robert E. Lee's army, he was with the 31st Maine, stormed the Confederate entrenchments, and apparently fell from the entrenchments into the ditch below, breaking a rib. This is what his pension records say. Now, some doctors in those records say they saw no traces of a broken rib, but that's tough to diagnose sometimes. He was just an ordinary soldier, really, Daniel True Huntington. Not a lot of glory or glamour in his story, although I have not found any letters from him other than the stuff in the pension records. I haven't even found a photograph of him. He did live until he was 1918. He suffered from, during the war, malaria and, like, seems like every soldier did, diarrhea. On his claim forms, he said he suffered from neuralgia, chronic diarrhea with resulting alternate chronic constipation and hemorrhoids. This is not something you want carved in your tombstone. And speaking of tombstone, this is his grave in Litchfield Plain Cemetery, Litchfield, Maine, which is about 15 miles outside of Augusta. And it's funny, when I was a kid, I mean, this is my father's grandfather. This is my grandmother's father-in-law. We would go to put flowers on my grandfather's grave. He's buried not far at all from this headstone. And I would look over and see Huntington carved on another stone. And I asked my family, who is that? And as I recall, none of them knew, or at least they said they didn't know. I think my father said it might have been an uncle or something, but it was Daniel True Huntington, who had served at the 31st Maine until pretty much the end of the war. And another person buried in the same cemetery, which I was completely unaware of until I was driving out after visiting my great-grandfather's grave, is Andrew Tozier from the 20th Maine. And he is in the first book, Maine Roads to Gettysburg. He was originally with the 2nd Maine. He was one of those soldiers in the 2nd Maine who did not realize they had enlisted for 3 years instead of 1. And when most of that regiment was mustered out, these disgruntled soldiers of the 2nd Maine who were told they had signed for 3 years, whether they knew it or not, sort of mutinied and were turned over to Joshua Chamberlain in the 20th Maine to handle, and he handled them quite well. And one of them was Tozier. Now, Tozier, on the march to Gettysburg, replaced the 20th Maine's color bearer, who became unbearably drunk. I think he found some whiskey at a house on the way and was so drunk he couldn't stand up. So Tozier took the flag, and he was bearing the flag on Little Round Top during that big fight on July 2nd. After the war, he fell on hard times. Chamberlain got him a job in his household staff, and he worked very hard to get Tozier the Medal of Honor for his actions at Little Round Top on July 2nd, 1863, and he did receive the Medal of Honor. And now he's buried in the same cemetery as my great-grandfather. And I have to wonder, did these two Civil War veterans know each other? Did they ever talk about the war together? I don't know, but it's something to speculate about. And hopefully, maybe I'll find some evidence that they did.
Perfect.
And now we're back with an image. This is another guy who did not appear in the first book, because this is the colonel of the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery. This is Daniel Chaplin. And of course, they were not at Gettysburg either, so they did not appear in this book, but they play a big role in the upcoming book. Chaplin was born in Naples. He had been a bookkeeper in Bangor, and he was a classic citizen soldier. He enlisted as a private in the 2nd Maine and fought with them on the peninsula. Rose to the rank of major and was offered command of a new regiment, which at that point was the 18th Maine, while he was still at Harrison's Landing after McClellan's change of base or retreat, whichever term you prefer. And so he became the colonel of the 18th Maine, which was sent to man the defenses of Washington, D.C. It was a big regiment, 1,800 people, which is huge, especially at that point in the war. And then I think in December maybe of 1863, they were changed to the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery, and they would start to get trained in artillery pieces. They have the unfortunate distinction of suffering the greatest loss of any single regiment in a single action during the war. And that action was in front of Petersburg on June 18th, 1864. They lost 115 men killed, 489 wounded, and 28 missing. What's the saying that one death is a tragedy, 1,000 deaths is a statistic? I cannot grapple with lists of casualties like that. It doesn't really impact me that much. I say, well, that's a lot of people, but what I like to do is tell the stories of individual soldiers, and there's so many horrific stories. And one story I'm going to tell in this book is of a guy from 1st Maine Heavy Artillery, Joel Brown. And on that attack of June 18th in front of Petersburg, they were ordered forward. They were still rather green. They had one big fight in May 19th, but they were still green soldiers, and they advanced while the veteran regiments to each side of them knew better, and they held back. So the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery went forward pretty much unsupported, and they were slaughtered. As Joel Brown said, and I'll quote, he said, "I saw the blinding flash of red flame run along the crest of those works and heard the deafening crash as the awful work began. Then the air seemed filled with all the sounds it was possible for it to contain. The hiss of the deadly Minnie, the scream of the shell, the crackle, crash, and roar of every conceivable missile. And through it all, that red blaze along the crest of that work which we must cross, as we, with bowed heads, breasted that storm." Brown obviously did survive. He was shot in the heel and had to lay flat in his face between the contending lines until he was able to crawl back to safety. And according to his account, now he saw Chaplin, who was, I think, in command of the brigade at that point. He saw Chaplin approached by another officer. It might have been David Birney. And Birney said, "Colonel Chaplin, where are your men?" And the division, and he replied, "There they are out in the field where your tried veterans dared not go. Here, you can take my sword. I have no use for it now." And then, according to Brown, Chaplin sat down on the ground and cried. I mean, these are men he had grown up with. He knew some of them were friends, and they had been slaughtered. General Regis de Trobriand believed that the June 18th action just completely shattered Chaplin. He said he escaped the butchery, but it struck him a mortal blow from which he did not recover. His men belonged to the same neighborhood with him. He had organized them. He had led them from the forests of Maine. They were his great family. When he saw them sacrificed under his eyes by a fantasy as deadly as useless, and that fantasy being that charge could succeed, a melancholy discouragement took hold on him, and he was killed by a sharpshooter on August 17th, 1864. So it's very much a tragic story, that of the 18th Maine. So we're going to be bouncing back and forth in time. a little bit. This is one of my favorite characters from the first book, Maine Roads to Gettysburg. This is Charles O. Hunt, who was in the 5th Maine Battery. And Hunt had been wounded at Gettysburg on the first day, and his sister, who happened to have married a bookkeeper, a bank bookkeeper or bank clerk from Gettysburg, lived just off the square in Gettysburg. So Hunt rode a horse to his sister's house and waited out the battle there. And he's an interesting character. And I mentioned I just came back from Bowdoin. And one thing I did, I'm going to go forward one here. We have these 2 huge volumes that Hunt compiled after the war, in which he transcribed all his Civil War letters and then filled in the gaps in the narrative by explaining what happened. He pasted in pictures, he pasted in Confederate bills he had picked up, and it's just a fascinating personal history of the war. I mean, they're big books. This is volume 1. You can see it's suffered some wear and tear over the years. But fascinating stories. So I just love reading about Charles O. Hunt. He also had a brother, Henry, who was in the same 5th Maine Battery. And Henry's mother has a scrapbook, also at Bowdoin College, in which she transcribed all of Henry's letters. So you get quite a detailed history of the 5th Maine Battery and out there. And we'll get back to Maddox in a minute, as his story intersects with another story. And that story is of Charles Maddox, who started out in the 17th Maine, and he too appears in the Maine Roads to Gettysburg because he fought with the regiment behind the stone wall in the wheat field and left just really good accounts of what he experienced. He was a Bowdoin graduate, so he knew Joshua Chamberlain as one of his teachers. One of the soldiers in the 17th Maine, John Haley, who gets often quoted because his journals were published as a book called The Rebel Yell and the Yankee Hurrah. He was a very cynical, sardonic soldier and had no liking for Charles Maddox, who he said he was very pompous and had yards and yards of red tape about him. And reading Maddox's letters and journal entries, you can see what Haley was talking about, because Maddox, when he did get into command, was a strict disciplinarian. He, at the start of the Overland Campaign, was promoted to take command of the 2nd U.S. Sharpshooters. And so he was with the sharpshooters in the wilderness on the first day's fighting when he heard some of his men firing in advance of the line. So he went to pull them back before they got captured. And as luck would have it, he got captured instead. So he suffered through a whole bunch of prison camps, wrote a very interesting account of those. And one of these soldiers he ended up being imprisoned with was none other than Charles O. Hunt. Now, Hunt, who had survived his wound at Gettysburg, returned to his battery. And in front of Petersburg in June of 1864, was going to go out and supervise the building of some earthworks around his guns. He asked a General Wheaton, how to get to the position, and Wheaton pointed him down the road and said, just ride straight forward and you'll find them. Well, he rode straight forward. He rode through the picket lines unknown to him because there was a gap, and he rode right into the rebel lines and he was captured. And he and Maddox ended up sharing a prison camp in North Carolina, and with another soldier from the 4th Maine, they escaped, or they attempted to escape, and they were going to try to make their way to Knoxville, Tennessee, which is about 200 miles away. They almost made it. They didn't quite make it, and it was just a difficult journey. I think Hunt said it quite destroyed his courage. Not only just blisters, the tension of trying to avoid capture, trying to figure out who could help them, who couldn't. African American slaves would always help them. White Confederates, they weren't quite sure who's a Union sympathizer, who isn't. So they had to approach everyone with wariness. And eventually they did get caught just not too far from Union lines. Completely disappointing, but a fascinating tale of adventure. So I'll tell that story in some depth, I think, in the new book. And there was another guy from the 17th Maine. It's kind of an embarrassment of riches, the 17th Maine, because you got Maddox left his accounts, Haley, of course, left his accounts, and Bowdoin has the diaries of this gentleman. This is Edwin Emery, another Bowdoin graduate. He was in class of 1861, and he was actually kind of old. He was 27 when he enlisted in the 17th Maine as a substitute. A fellow Bowdoin student preferred not to go to war, so he bought his way out, and Emory went in as his substitute. Left very interesting diaries. He was an interesting character. He was a devout Christian. He didn't drink, gamble, or swear, and he had no patience for anyone who did. And his journals are full of references to the vulgar behavior of his fellow soldiers. Um, Here's one quote from him. He says, "I knew how my folks would feel to see me in such a situation," he wrote. This is on the boat going down to join his regiment. "But the more I thought of my situation, my companions, and my surroundings, the more I rejoiced that I had entered the army. I feel that there is a great need of good and honest men in it. All day there were profanity, obscenity, gambling, and everything evil going on." So Emory, he's an interesting person. He was wounded at Spotsylvania. He was shot in the left thigh. As he lay on the ground, he was hit for a second time in the neck. He initially thought his jaw had been shot off. The rebels, during a countercharge, marched right over him, and one of them, much to his indignation, stole his handkerchief. He lay next to a fellow wounded soldier from a New York regiment. He said, "We lay together. We had nothing to eat, no water to drink, except some 2 or 3 swallows of rainwater caught in a small half-pint dipper. It was a cold and rainy day. When he was wounded in the thigh, he said, it felt just as though I had received a very severe shock of electricity. My foot was completely paralyzed." And not until nighttime was he able to get rescued and pulled back to the safety of the Union lines. So some interesting experiences there. This is Selden Connor. I did mention that I went to Providence, Rhode Island. Brown University has his papers. He was a very, very good letter writer. I would like to see all his letters published. I used them extensively in Maine Roads to Gettysburg. He was with the 7th Maine for the early part of the war. He actually had joined a Vermont regiment in the very beginning of the war as a 3-month regiment, saw no action, but he was from Maine, so he ended up joining the 7th Maine. He was good friends with another soldier named Thomas Hyde that we'll talk about. The 7th didn't see much action at Gettysburg. You may have seen their monument. It's hard to get to. It's one of the least visited parts of the field. It's on the so-called Lost Avenue or Neal Avenue. That's where the 7th Maine monument is. During the winter in December of 1863, he received word that he was promoted to command the 19th Maine. He was on court-martial duty in Portland at the time, so he wasn't able to rejoin the army until, I think, February. And at that point, he was put in command of the brigade temporarily. So he didn't actually join his new regiment until, I think, April. And he was in command for less than a month, just slightly over a month, because on May 6th, the second day of fighting in the wilderness, he was shot in the thigh. It was a bad wound. It shattered the bone. The doctors, and he writes of this in his letters, which can be a little gruesome at times. They sawed off the ends of the 2 ends of the broken bone to try to fuse them back together. He expected he might be in the hospital until June. He was in there through May of 1865, when he was carried on a stretcher so he could go see the Grand Review of the Armies in Washington, D.C. And it was tough for him. And I found one of his letters he wrote in I think, February, maybe, of 1865 to his sister. And he wrote this. He says, "Can you realize it, Nan, that the brother who always rejoiced so much in health and strength, who was so fond of athletic exercises, tramping through the woods and along the streams, will henceforth be an occupier of the chimney corner, like an old man in his second childhood?" And as I said, it was a severe wound, and making things worse is after the war, he was recuperating at home and he fell in his house, re-broke the leg, and couldn't leave the house for 2 years. But somehow he's not only survived it, he thrived. He became Maine's governor, after the war. But fascinating experiences and really well recorded by Selden Connor. This is one of the things I found in his papers at Providence. This is one of the telegrams sent to his family back in Maine after he was wounded on May 6th. And it says, "You are aware Colonel Connor is severely wounded." Not the telegram that every family dreaded receiving. His brother Virgil and his other brother Will did spend a lot of time with him in the hospitals in Washington. According to one of his letters, Virgil was there not only to make sure that the wound didn't start bleeding again, but also to shoo the flies away, which gives you a hint of what hospital life in Washington D.C. during the summer was like. It was awful. Interesting. Connor was still in the hospital on April 14th, 1865, when Lincoln was assassinated, and one of his army nurses had been posted to take care of Secretary of State William Seward, who was attacked by one of the of John Wilkes Booth's conspirators. And this army nurse fought the assassin off and was badly stabbed and ended up in the same hospital ward as Selden Connor as he was recovering. So it's a small world. And of course, I do write about the 20th Maine. I wrote about the 20th Maine a lot in the first book. I write about them a lot in this book. Joshua Chamberlain, of course, will appear in this book, though he was largely in brigade command in 1864, 1865. Quite often, this gentleman was in command of the regiment. This is Ellis Spear. You may have heard his name before. He was the acting major at Little Round Top on July 2nd. He had been born in Warren, Maine. He was another Bowdoin College graduate. He was teaching school in Wiscasset, the coastal town of Wiscasset, when the war began. And he stayed with the 20th Maine for most of the war, though later he became command of the 198th Pennsylvania towards the end of the war. He wrote down his accounts of the war in his journals, which a relative eventually published not too often long ago, and they're very interesting accounts. Spear can be a little sardonic. He was close with Chamberlain. He became, I guess you could say, disenchanted with Chamberlain. Later in the war, I know he was really angry with Chamberlain's account of Fredericksburg that appeared in, I think, Cosmopolitan magazine. He wrote the first commander of the 20th Maine, Delbert Ames, and complained he didn't know whether it was fact or fiction. I think one thing that really bugged him about Chamberlain as the years went on is that Chamberlain was willing to accept all the accolades that were given to him. I think this lack of modesty might have angered him a bit too. But he did write a lot of letters to Ames, the first commander, which are at the Smith College in Amherst, Massachusetts. I read them for the first book, and one of my favorite quotes came from those letters. Spear was writing to Ames on the 60th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. And he was discussing whether or not he would attend the 20th Maine's reunion. He said even though it would mean hearing the old stories he had heard time and time again. And then he wrote, quote, "It will remind me doubtless of the story of a guest of mine whom I entertained at my summer home in Maine some 10 years ago, and whom I took out deep sea fishing. He was a landsman, but by some accident caught a little codfish. The fish was about a foot long when caught, but the last time I heard the story, he was long as a piano." And I find that amusing. I think that kind of captures Spear's attitude. And he did write some really interesting letters. Another soldier from the 20th Maine is this gentleman, Holman Melcher. Again, he is in the Maine Roads to Gettysburg book. He was also with the Color Company on Little Round Top. He is, some people give him credit for starting the bayonet charge, the famous bayonet charge on Little Round Top, when he moved his Color Company forward to cover some of the wounded who were lying between the two contending lines. And he was wounded on May 8th, 1864 in the Wilderness. And he had to return home to recover, and he didn't get back to the regiment until October. And I was intrigued to see this letter from November 17th, 1864, to his brother, in which he encouraged him not to enlist. He says, I admire your patriotism and courage, but please do not enlist, or it may be your misfortune to know how bullets feel, as well as sound. And then you will be compelled to walk, if you could walk at all, with a cane, like I still have to do. One cripple in the family is bad enough, so do take care of yourself. That's Holman Melcher. Let me see. I'm still figuring out which mouse to use here. I'm sorry, this one's a little tiny, but this is another 20th Maine soldier. This is Walter Morrill. Again, he fought at Little Round Top. His Company B was sent out by Chamberlain as skirmishers. They took a position behind a stone wall, and during the final rout of the Alabamians that were attacking the 20th Maine, they rose up and fired into their flanks and just caused a complete panic. He apparently was a soldier's soldier. His men admired him. I think he seems like a classic Mainer. He's taciturn, just doing his job. He too was injured in the wilderness. He advanced to the company of the 20th Maine, and he realized he had been outflanked by the rebels and tried to fall back. He had taken 47 men into combat. 33 of them were killed, wounded, or captured. Morrill himself was shot in the face. The bullet entered his cheek and embedded itself in the roof of his mouth. He was choking on his own blood when he was taken to the rear, where he passed out, and the doctors actually thought it was a mortal wound. But he revived. He was able to pry the bullet out of the roof of his mouth with his fingers, and he kept it as a souvenir. And then he eventually did return to the regiment. I mean, how did they do it? I don't know. I don't know. This is a soldier from the 32nd Maine. Now, I'm interested in the 32nd Maine because as I mentioned, my grandfather was in the 31st. These are the last two regiments raised by Maine for the Civil War. The 32nd was eventually folded into the 31st. Both regiments suffered so badly during the Overland Campaign that eventually the 32nd was disbanded and merged into the 31st. They fought in the Battle of the Crater. And I believe my great-grandfather was at the Battle of the Crater. And this was, of course, when the Union tried to blow up a portion of the Confederate earthworks outside Petersburg. And the plan was they would storm through and break the Confederate lines. And due to an unending series of failures, that didn't happen. They did blow it up. It was a massive explosion. It did leave a crater. But instead of attacking around the flanks of the crater and moving left and right, the soldiers just poured into this pit where they were mercilessly gunned down by counter-attacking Confederate soldiers. And Chase was wounded, and he later wrote just a vivid account of his experiences, which are a little difficult to read sometimes. He was hit in the left temple, and the bullet passed behind his left eye, popping the eye out of its socket. It was dangling down his cheek, and it exited from the other side of his nose, sending splinters of bone into his right eye. Chase was sure he was dead. He thought it was a mortal wound. He said, "Captain, I must die," to his captain. And the captain said, "Yes, Chase, you have got a death shot." But then another captain came up and took a look and wasn't so pessimistic. He gave Chase some water, some whiskey, and he took a knife and took out the little fragments of bone that had entered his right eye. He said, "I want to save that eye, for it's a great blessing to have one if you can't have two." And for the first time, Chase felt some hope. He did survive. Unfortunately, his right eye eventually failed him, and he was blind for the rest of his life. And I think he was just a kid in his 20s at the time, as you can tell from this photograph. It does give you a sense of just what people suffered and sacrificed, for this war. I do get tired of accounts that that have things like glory of valor in the title, because war is hell, and these people went through. A lot of them went through just terrible, terrible experiences. And not, of course, all of them emerged alive at the end. It was brutal. Um, and then here's Thomas Hyde, and he's another soldier who left behind some really interesting accounts. He was from Bath, Maine. He served with Selden Connor in the 7th Maine, and they became fast friends. In fact, I was just reading Selden Connor's letters. He describes how in December of 1863 he visited Hyde and his family in Bath. They went sleigh riding. He was flirting with Hyde's sister, and he said it was the pleasantest time I've ever had in my life. Hyde went on actually to serve later on the staff of General John Sedgwick, and he was with Sedgwick when Sedgwick was killed by a sharpshooter's bullet outside Spotsylvania. I think, what was that, May 9th, 1864. And like all of Sedgwick's staffers, Hyde was just loved Sedgwick. He was a father figure to him, and his death just came as a complete shock. And he decided he was not going to reenlist. He was thinking about reenlisting. He was not going to do it because the death of Sedgwick just took too much out of him. But he did fight for the rest of the war. He had a particularly horrific experience on the first day in the wilderness when he was a staff officer delivering messages, back and forth on the battlefield. He had dismounted to adjust his horse's bridle. He was near a New Jersey brigade when a rebel cannonball tore the head off a soldier standing near him. The head went flying through the air, hit Hyde, and knocked him to the ground, leaving him covered with, as he said, brains and blood. Even my mouth, probably gaping in wonder where that shell would strike, was filled, and everybody thought it was all over with me. He said he managed to struggle to his feet, but said he was not much use as a staff officer for fully 15 minutes. So, as you can imagine. But Hyde survived the war. He went on, he commanded a brigade. He became the military governor of Danville, Virginia, after Lee's surrender. And then after returning to Maine, he founded Bath Iron Works, which, as many of you probably know, is still a going concern today. He was a Bowdoin graduate, like a lot of these people were. It's kind of a small world, because you read their letters and journals, and Hyde talks about visiting Connor. Connor talks about visiting Hyde. Charles O. Hunt, who was a Bowdoin graduate, talks about visiting both of them. They're always, sharing news of their friends with their family back home. So it was kind of a small world. And of course, when your friends were wounded or killed, it had a profound impact on you. And back then, they didn't know anything about PTSD or anything like that. But I'm sure a lot of these soldiers suffered psychologically after the war, after seeing all this stuff. I'm looking at the questions here. Someone asked about if I had could find a picture of his grandfather, a Maryland soldier. It could be out there, but I got to find a picture of my great grandfather first. That's top of my priority. I'm afraid that probably isn't going to happen, but we'll see. I would love to hear about his accounts of the war. It's interesting. You do find the journals and the letters and stuff, but for every soldier you can read about in personal accounts like that, it's probably 1,000 who either didn't write or couldn't write, or the letters were lost. So so many stories of the Civil War are gone forever. But it's always just a great feeling when you stumble across a really good account of the war that really brings the whole experience to life vividly. And that's just a great thing about researching. And I always look forward to these research trips, because you just never know what you're going to find. And I in Maine Roads to Gettysburg, I was going through Abner Small's collection at the Maine Historical Society. He was with the 16th Maine, and he was with the 16th Maine at Gettysburg, and the famous incident where they tore their flag up to keep it from being captured, and distributed the pieces to the surviving soldiers who kept them. And I found small star from that flag pasted into his scrapbook at the Maine Historical Society. And what a rush that was, turning that page. And there you see the star from the flag that was carried at the Battle of Gettysburg on July 1st, 1863. That was just one of the coolest experiences of my researching life.
Research in Maine, I'm going to speak slowly because of the echo.
Okay.
Here in Philadelphia, with our research archives and stuff, in the surrounding area, we have a rich amount of history with the GAR, which is where you can find things like photos because you can locate what posts these ancestors were in and then look into the post. How's Maine doing up there with G? Do they have anything like we have here in Philadelphia?
The Maine State Archives does. They have a thing called the Civil War Regimental Correspondence, which is every letter sent to the state adjutant general during the war about essentially the business and the process of fighting a war and raising the regiments and equipping the regiments. It's a lot of mundane paperwork, but occasionally you do find just these amazing accounts. And for Maine Roads at Gettysburg, I found the letters from Freeman McGilvery, the artilleryman who helped save the day at Gettysburg, and Edwin Dow, who went on to command, replace McGilvery as the head of the 6th Maine Battery. And these two men didn't like each other. When McGilvery was promoted, he was doing everything he could to make sure that Dow did not get command of the regiment. Dow was infuriated, and he was threatening to have McGilvery court-martialed for haranguing his men into near mutiny. And it was a long series of letters. And you read these things, you think, wow, that is fantastic, man. That is great stuff. When I was up there last time, I found letters from, after the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery was decimated, at that attack on June 18th, there were a lot of letters sent to the state saying, essentially, I haven't heard from my husband, in months. I haven't heard from my son. I haven't heard from my cousin. Can you please tell me if they are still alive? And for every letter written, there's probably 100 people who weren't writing the letters asking, and that just shows you just what the experience in the home front was like when your loved ones just vanished without a trace. And in some cases, they're lucky enough to find out what happened. In some cases, they never heard from them again. They were probably buried in an unmarked grave and just an unknown soldier buried in the battlefield. So they have that, and they do have a lot of photographs. They have a lot of Civil War photographs in their archives up there, and they've all been scanned. And they are in the process of scanning all the regimental correspondence as well. Some regiments are done, including the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery. So I have found a lot of good photos, but unfortunately, I have not found my great grandfather. So,
Fred, why don't you elaborate on what sort of opinion of Little Round Top you would like to hear from Tom? How about I ask, hey, Tom, what's your opinion on the legacy of Little Round Top with the 20th Maine?
That's a good question, and it's a somewhat complicated question. I admire and appreciate Joshua Chamberlain. I think he did an amazing job on Little Round Top, much like Meade did as a new commander of the Army of the Potomac and winning that battle at Gettysburg. Chamberlain had been in command of the 20th Maine only since the month before, when Ames was promoted to brigade command. Little Round Top was the first time he had commanded the brigade in combat. And I think he did a tremendous job. I am distressed by the number of people who find that the one way to show how much you know about the Civil War is by saying something disparaging about Joshua Chamberlain. You take the tour. If you take a tour of Little Round Top, someone is going to use the air quotes and say, can you tell us about the man who saved the Union? He was a brave man. He sacrificed a great deal during the war. I didn't mention his wounding. He was wounded in front of Petersburg on, I think, June 18th, 1864. A wound that afflicted him for the rest of his life. He had to use a catheter for the rest of his life. So imagine that. Yet he still returned to the Army. And he was with the Army at the end when Lee surrendered. And he oversaw the official formal surrender of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. I do think sometimes Chamberlain exaggerated his accounts. I think his account of Fredericksburg does bug me. I don't know if editors told him to spice it up a little bit, but he told some stories that Speer and the historical evidence does seem to indicate did not happen. But Uh, he was a classic citizen soldier. He volunteered to fight for his country. He suffered terribly as a result of that decision. So I think he deserves respect. And people say, well, Little Round Top didn't matter. Even if the Confederates had captured Little Round Top, it wouldn't have mattered. Well, maybe not. Culp's Hill was more important. Yeah, Culp's Hill is very important, but it's not like a zero-sum game. If you give Chamberlain credit at Little Round Top, that you're taking it away from David Ireland and George Sears Green on Culp's Hill. So I think he deserves respect, and you know it's kind of like pink hat syndrome. Boston Red Sox fans, of which I am one, even though they're trying my patience, um, have what they call the pink hat syndrome, which it's a little sexist, but it indicates like fair weather fans who just go to Fenway Park to do the wave and drink beer and have a good time, but don't care about the team. And I think people look at people who have only a slight knowledge or interest in the Civil War, but they all know who Joshua Chamberlain is because of the movie Gettysburg and the book Killer Angels, um, and and people get irritated by that. Or he wasn't the most important guy at Gettysburg. He did not save the Union, which he never claimed he saved the Union. So there's a kind of a backlash. It's what they call in Australia the tall poppy syndrome. When one poppy raises its head up above the rest, it gets lopped off. And I see a lot of that going on with Chamberlain these days. Um, but he's my fraternity brother. I have to defend him.
I think that's well said. I think people with pink hat syndrome fail to realize that when they go to the ballpark, tickets might be $600 if you didn't have fair weather friends.
Yeah, that's true too.
So maybe we should take our excuse me, I'm sorry, I said delay. Take our fans where we can get them. Bring them along with us.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, my daughter had a pink hat, and I'm not going to disparage her for that.
Very good. I have a question. This 1 to 3 year enlistment debacle. I feel like if there was enough to have a mutiny, there must have been a serious discrepancy in the communication going on. Was that ever ironed out? How that came about? Is there something nefarious?
Well, it's just the recruiting process. I think as the requirements changed, some people signed for 3 years, and maybe they didn't even read the enlistment papers, and then they see their comrades who signed up for 1 year going home. They said, well, I should be able to go home too. And they were said, well, you can't, he can. And they refused to fight. It was essentially a mutiny. And I think who was it who gave him to Chamberlain, said, you take care of this. Now I can't remember, but it's in the other book. But almost all of them fell into line, and Chamberlain dealt with them very well. He said, I'm going to treat you like soldiers. I'm not going to treat you like criminals. And he was patient. He was lenient. Unlike someone like Ames, his predecessor in command. I think Ames would have just unleashed hell on these soldiers, and tried to beat them into submission. But Chamberlain used tact and diplomacy and was able to get almost all of them on his side. But it was not, the records are all on paper. You remember you signed these papers, and then they were filed away in the state capitol in Augusta. Then they do the muster rolls and the all that stuff during the war. It was nonstop paperwork, seeing who is still in the regiment, who's accounted for, who's unaccounted for, who's deserted. So it's not something. It wasn't a database you could look up anywhere to see who signed what. That's why people would write to John Hodgson, the state adjutant general, asking. There's quite a few letters like, do you have any records of so and so in my regiment, because he claims he signed for 2 years and we don't have any record of that, and so forth and so on. It's just that's what happens when you're fighting a war in the 1800s.
what's the next step for you? Because you're a retired man, and you want to know what you're going to be working
Yeah.
on.
Well, I'm working on this book now, and it's not due for another year. July 15, 2026, I have to deliver this manuscript. And then it should be out in, spring, summer of 2027, I hope. So that's what I'm going to be doing. Going up to Maine again, July for a week, going up in September, maybe 2 weeks. And I'm just going to suffer from severe eye strain trying to read cursive writing from the 1860s. But it's a sacrifice I'm willing to make. At least no one's shooting at me.
All right. Well, that's great. Well, thank you so much. And thank you, everybody. And we'll see you after summer break. And God bless. Thank you, Tom. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
All right.